There's a building in Alexandria, Virginia. It's 3 stories tall, made of brick. Beautiful federal-style architecture. It sits on Duke Street, just a few blocks from the Potomac River. Between 1828 and 1836, this building was headquarters for the largest slave trading company in American history, Franklin and Armfield. They bought and sold over 1,000 people every single year. They made millions of dollars in today's money. They had agents in almost every southern city. They owned ships. They created a system, and they called what they did business. Let's start with the 2 men who built this operation. Isaac Franklin was born in 1789 in Tennessee. He came from a poor family. In 1808, when he was just 19 years old, he traveled with his older brothers to Baltimore and Alexandria to buy enslaved people. They walked their purchases in chains over the Appalachian Mountains, put them on a flatboat, and floated down the Cumberland, Ohio, and Mississippi rivers to sell them in Natchez and New Orleans. That was Isaac Franklin's introduction to the domestic slave trade, and he never looked back. His brothers mostly left the trade after the War of 1812, but Isaac threw himself deeper into it. By the early 1820s, he had a regular business location in Natchez, and he was well known to sellers in Maryland and Northern Virginia. John Armfield was born in 1797 in Guilford County, North Carolina. He tried running a store for a while, but it didn't work out. In 1824, he met Isaac Franklin, and Franklin apparently suggested he try the slave trade. It was profitable, it was growing, and Armfield decided to give it a shot. In the spring of 1826, Armfield placed his first newspaper ad announcing he wanted to buy enslaved people. He told readers of the Alexandria newspaper to leave him a letter at the post office or find him at a tavern. For the next 2 years, Armfield bought several dozen people at a time in Virginia and North Carolina, took them south, and sold them in Natchez and New Orleans. In 1828, Franklin and Armfield formalized their partnership. They called it Franklin and Armfield. They put together about $20,000 in capital. That's roughly $500,000 in today's money. And they set out to become the biggest players in the interstate slave trade. Here's how they divided the work. Armfield would stay in Alexandria and handle buying. Franklin would stay in Natchez and New Orleans and handle selling. They'd transport people from Virginia to the Deep South, where prices were much higher. Buy low, sell high, basic business. Except they were trading in human beings. Armfield rented a 3-story townhouse on Duke Street in Alexandria. The building had been built around 1812 as a home for General Robert Young. It was a nice house in a good location, close to the docks, close to the main roads. Armfield expanded it. He added slave pens in the yard behind the house. He turned the basement into holding areas. He built walls around the property. He created what one city tax official in 1829 called Franklin's Black Hole. The front of the building was Armfield's residence. He lived there, but behind it was a complex designed to hold large numbers of people. The 1830 federal census shows they held up to 145 enslaved people on the property at one time. People were chained and confined in basements, yards, and outbuildings. At night, enslaved people slept in a 2-story rear wing with grated doors and windows, like a prison. During the day, they'd be kept in the walled pens. There was a kitchen building and a tailor's shop where people would be given 2 sets of clothes before being shipped south. Armfield started advertising aggressively. "We will give cash for 100 likely young Negroes," read one ad in 1828. Persons who wish to sell would do well to give us a call, as the Negroes are wanted immediately. We will give more than any other purchasers that are in the market, or may hereafter come into the market. Notice the specifics. He wanted young people. That was key. Young people could work harder, live longer, bear children. They were more valuable. He was offering to pay more than anyone else. And he wanted them immediately because he had ships waiting. Franklin and Armfield didn't just operate out of Alexandria. They built a network. By the early 1830s, they had agents in at least 5 cities buying people for them. R.C. Ballard and Company in Richmond, Virginia, J.M. Saunders and Company in Warrenton, Virginia, George Kephart and Company in Fredericktown, Maryland, James F. Purvis and Company in Baltimore, Thomas M. Jones in Easton on Maryland's eastern shore, plus other agents in Port Tobacco, Annapolis, and Fredericksburg. These agents would buy enslaved people in their areas and send them to Alexandria. It was a supply chain, an efficient system designed to gather as many people as possible and funnel them through the Alexandria office. Here's how it worked. Throughout Virginia, Maryland, and parts of North Carolina, sellers knew they could get good prices from Franklin and Armfield's agents. Maybe you were a plantation owner who needed cash. Maybe someone had died and the estate needed to be settled. Maybe you wanted to punish someone by threatening to sell them down the river. Whatever the reason, you could sell to a Franklin and Armfield agent. The agents would buy people, sometimes individually, sometimes in small groups, and send them to Alexandria. The network was extensive and well organized. Each agent knew to look for young, healthy people who would fetch the highest prices in the Deep South. They'd inspect people carefully, checking their physical condition, their age, their ability to work. Sellers could get cash immediately. That was part of Franklin and Armfield's appeal. They always had money available. While some traders operated on credit or delayed payment, Franklin and Armfield paid in cash on the spot. For plantation owners facing financial difficulties, this was attractive. Armfield would hold people at the Duke Street office until he had enough for a shipment. Sometimes this meant people waited weeks or even months. During that time, they'd be fed basic rations, enough to keep them healthy for sale, but nothing more. They'd be given 2 sets of clothes from the tailor's shop. They'd be kept behind walls, unable to escape, unable to communicate with anyone outside. The psychological torture of this waiting period is hard to imagine. You've been sold. You're being held in what's essentially a prison. You don't know exactly when you'll be shipped out. You don't know where exactly you'll end up. You don't know if you'll ever see your family again, and you can do nothing but wait. Then Armfield would decide it was time for a shipment. He'd organize transportation using one of 2 methods depending on the season. Method 1, by ship. Franklin and Armfield owned at least 2 coastal brigs, the Uncas and the Tribune. Every month from October to May, these ships would sail from Alexandria, down the Potomac River, out to the Atlantic, down the coast, and into New Orleans. The voyage took about 2 weeks if weather cooperated. The ships would be packed with enslaved people chained below deck. Then the ships would load up with sugar and other goods and sail back to Alexandria. The conditions on these ships were terrible. People were packed tightly in the holds. There was minimal ventilation. Sanitation was poor. Food and water were rationed. Many people got seasick in the rough Atlantic waters. Some died during the voyage. Those who survived arrived weak, traumatized, and facing an uncertain future. There were even maritime incidents. In 1831, a ship called the Comet was carrying 164 enslaved people, including 76 owned by Franklin and Armfield, when it wrecked in the Bahamas. While waiting for repairs in Nassau, 11 people escaped. They were captured, but the British governor declared them free since slavery had been abolished in the British Empire. Franklin and Armfield lost that human property, but it didn't slow their operation. Method 2. By land. In the summer, when Atlantic storms made sailing dangerous, they'd march people overland. Armed guards would chain people together in groups. These were called coffles, and march them through Virginia, across Tennessee, into Mississippi. It was hundreds of miles on foot. The journey would take weeks, sometimes over a month. Men would be chained together at the wrists or ankles to prevent escape. Women and children might walk unchained, but under constant guard with guns and whips. They'd march all day, covering maybe 15 to 20 miles. At night, they'd sleep outside under guard, or sometimes in barns if the coffle passed near a friendly property. The guards were experienced. They knew how to move large groups of people efficiently. They knew how to prevent escapes. They knew the routes. They'd done this many times before. For them, it was just work. For the people they were guarding, it was a nightmare march to an unknown future. Towns along the route would see these coffles passing through, chained people walking in lines through the streets. It wasn't unusual. It was a regular sight in the 1830s. Most townspeople just accepted it as normal commercial activity. Whether by ship or by land, the destination was the same, Natchez or New Orleans. That's where Isaac Franklin operated. Natchez had a slave market called the Forks of the Road. It was the second largest slave market in the South after New Orleans. Franklin had an office there. He also had a sales compound in New Orleans. When the enslaved people arrived, Franklin would sell them, sometimes in bulk to plantation owners who needed workers, sometimes individually to people looking for domestic workers, skilled laborers, or young women. The prices in the Deep South were much higher than in Virginia or Maryland. That difference was Franklin and Armfield's profit. Let me give you some numbers. In the early 1830s, Franklin and Armfield bought and sold between 1,000 and 2,000 people every year. Conservative estimates say they sold at least 1,200 people annually at their peak. Ship manifests from the National Archives show at least 5,000 people were trafficked through the Alexandria office, though the real number was probably much higher. The profits were enormous. In just 1 year, 1831 to 1832, the firm counted $250,000 in bills receivable. That's money owed to them from sales. They were making profits of up to $100,000 per year. In 1830s dollars, adjusted for inflation, that's millions today. Isaac Franklin became a millionaire. John Armfield, as junior partner, made about half that, but was still incredibly wealthy. They were two of the richest men in the nation, all from buying and selling human beings. Now let's talk about what this meant for the people being sold. First, understand the context. In 1808, Congress banned the international slave trade. You couldn't import enslaved people from Africa anymore. But the domestic slave trade was legal and growing. The Upper South, Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, had more enslaved people than the economy needed. Meanwhile, the Deep South, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, was booming with cotton and sugar plantations and desperately needed workers. So there was a huge demand to move people from the Upper South to the Deep South. And traders like Franklin and Armfield met that demand. For enslaved people in Virginia and Maryland, Being sold south was one of the worst fates imaginable. Jacob Stroyer, who'd been enslaved, wrote that Louisiana was considered by slaves a place of slaughter. Reverend Josiah Henson, who inspired the character of Uncle Tom in Uncle Tom's Cabin, wrote that the fear of being sold south filled enslaved people with perpetual dread. Why? Because working conditions in the Deep South were brutal, especially on sugar and cotton plantations. The work was harder, cutting sugar cane or picking cotton from dawn until dusk in intense heat. The climate was hotter and more humid than Virginia or Maryland. The treatment was often worse because the demand for productivity was higher. Disease was more common. Yellow fever, malaria, and other tropical illnesses that didn't exist as much in the Upper South. And most importantly, if you were sold south, you'd probably never see your family again. The distance was too great. Communication was impossible. You couldn't write letters if you couldn't read and write. You couldn't visit. You weren't allowed to travel. You couldn't send messages. Once you were sold to Louisiana or Mississippi, you were gone. Your family back in Virginia might wonder for the rest of their lives what happened to you, and you'd wonder about them. This is why the threat of being sold south was used as punishment. Enslavers in the Upper South would threaten people with it to maintain control. Behave or I'll sell you to the traders. It was the ultimate threat because everyone knew what it meant. Franklin and Armfield specialized in separating families. They preferred to buy young people without family ties, or at least they'd separate people from their families when they bought them. It was more profitable to sell individuals than family groups. Young single people fetched higher prices. Families were harder to sell and brought lower prices, so they'd deliberately separate people. A mother might be sold to one buyer, her children to different buyers, her husband to another. The family unit would be completely destroyed. And Franklin and Armfield did this thousands of times. They built their fortune on breaking apart families. Ship manifests list the people they transported, and reading them is heartbreaking. Bill Keeling, male, age 11, height 4 feet 5 inches. Elizabeth, female, age 10, height 4 feet 1 inch. Monroe, male, age 12, height 4 feet 7 inches. Lovey, female, age 10, height 3 feet 10 inches. Robert, male, age 12, height 4 feet 4 inches. Mary Fitchett, female, age 11, height 4 feet 11 inches. Children, 10, 11, 12 years old. Each one with a name, a height, an age. Each one torn from their family. Each one put on a ship. Each one sold in New Orleans to work on a plantation somewhere in Louisiana or Mississippi. Imagine being 10 years old. You're taken from your parents. You're held in a building with strangers for weeks. Then you're put on a ship and chained below deck for 2 weeks. Then you arrive in a strange city where you don't know anyone. Then you're sold to a stranger who takes you to a plantation where you'll work for the rest of your life. You'll never see your mother again. Never see your father again. Never know if they're even alive. That was the business Franklin and Armfield ran. That was what they did to thousands of children. The conditions at the Duke Street office were prison-like. People were chained. They were locked up at night behind grated doors and windows. They'd spend weeks or months there waiting for enough people to be gathered for a shipment, fed minimally, given basic clothes, treated as cargo waiting to be transported. Then came the journey. If you went by ship, you'd be packed below deck with dozens of other people. It was dark, crowded, unsanitary. The voyage took about 2 weeks if weather was good. People got sick. Some died. Those who survived arrived weakened and traumatized. If you went by land in a coffle, you'd be chained to other people and forced to march hundreds of miles, walking all day in all weather, sleeping rough, being watched constantly by armed guards. Anyone who couldn't keep up would be beaten or left behind. The journey could take a month or more, and at the end, you'd be sold, inspected like livestock, separated from anyone you'd traveled with, bought by strangers and put to work on plantations where the labor was backbreaking and dangerous. Franklin and Armfield knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't ignorant about where people were going or what conditions were like. Franklin operated in Natchez and New Orleans. He knew the plantations. He knew the work. And he sold people into it anyway, because it was profitable. In surviving letters between Franklin and Armfield, they're remarkably casual about their business. They discuss prices, shipping schedules, which agents are performing well. They treat people as inventory. There's no sense of moral conflict or doubt. It's just business. Some historians have found evidence that the partners even bragged about assaulting enslaved women who were being processed through their firm. The power they had was absolute. The people they held had no rights, no recourse, no way to resist. But both Franklin and Armfield worked hard to cultivate an image as respectable gentlemen. They dressed well. They had good manners. They spoke politely. They attended church. In 1831, Armfield married Isaac Franklin's 16-year-old niece, Martha Franklin, further cementing their family and business ties. They had no children. When an abolitionist named Ethan Andrews visited their Alexandria office in 1835, he described Armfield as a man of fine personal appearance and of engaging and graceful manners. Another visitor, British geologist G. W. Featherstonhaugh, described Armfield as a queer, tall animal about 40 years old, with dark black hair cut round as if he were a Methodist preacher, immense black whiskers, a physiognomy not without one or two tolerable features. These descriptions show how Armfield and Franklin presented themselves to the world, not as rough criminals or brutal traders, but as successful businessmen. They wanted to be seen as respectable members of society, and their wealth helped buy that respectability. The social stigma around slave trading was complicated in the 1830s. Many people looked down on slave traders. It was considered a crude profession, something beneath gentlemen. Polite society whispered about traders. They were necessary for the economy, but not necessarily welcomed into the finest social circles. But Franklin and Armfield had so much money that they could force their way into society. Wealth bought respectability, even if people whispered behind their backs. They could afford the finest clothes, the nicest houses, memberships in exclusive churches. Money opened doors that their profession might have otherwise closed, and they were careful about their public image. They ran legitimate businesses. They paid their taxes. They kept proper records. They advertised in respectable newspapers. They presented themselves as businessmen meeting market demand, not as villains or criminals. This is important to understand because it shows how systems of injustice normalize themselves. Franklin and Armfield weren't operating in shadows. They were operating in broad daylight, presenting themselves as respectable, and being largely accepted by society despite, or because of, their wealth. In 1836, Franklin retired. He was 47 years old and had made his fortune. He'd been in the slave trade for almost 30 years. He'd made millions, and he decided it was time to enjoy his wealth. He bought plantations in Tennessee and Louisiana. He invested his wealth in land and in enslaved people to work his own plantations. He became what he'd been supplying, a plantation owner. He lived the life of a wealthy planter, respected in his community, until his death in 1846. He was 57 years old when he died, having spent almost his entire adult life profiting from human suffering. Armfield gradually disbanded the firm after Franklin left. He sold the Duke Street property to their former agent George Kephart in 1836. The business model continued under Kephart, but the Franklin and Armfield partnership was over. But Armfield didn't completely retire from the trade until the 1850s. For almost 20 more years, he continued to be involved in buying and selling enslaved people, though not at the scale of the Franklin and Armfield years. He'd gotten used to the profits. He'd gotten used to the lifestyle, and the trade was still legal and profitable. Eventually, he moved to Beersheba Springs, Tennessee, a mountain resort area. He founded a resort there, investing his slave trading profits into building a vacation destination for wealthy Southern families. He invested in real estate across Tennessee. He became a major benefactor of Sewanee, the University of the South, a prestigious Episcopal university in Tennessee. He donated money. He served on boards. He was respected as a philanthropist and community leader. Both men established themselves as socially prominent citizens in their communities. They built fancy houses. They joined churches. Franklin was an Episcopalian, and his wife became one too. They donated to causes. They were invited to social events. They were treated as successful businessmen who'd made good investments. Neither one ever publicly expressed regret for what they'd done. In their surviving letters and documents, there's no sign of moral conflict. They never questioned whether separating thousands of families was wrong. They never seemed troubled by selling children. They treated it all as business, and successful business at that. They both died wealthy and respected. Franklin in 1846 at age 57, Armfield in 1871 at age 74. Neither one ever faced justice for separating thousands of families or condemning people to brutal conditions in the Deep South. No trials, no consequences, no accountability. They died in their beds, comfortable and honored in their communities, having built their fortunes on other people's suffering. The Duke Street building continued as a slave trading office until 1861. After Franklin and Armfield, it was operated by George Kephart and later by a firm called Price, Birch and Company. When Union troops occupied Alexandria in May 1861 at the start of the Civil War, they found the building had been abandoned by the traders. There was just one person left, an elderly man chained to the floor by his leg. During the war, the Union Army used the building as a prison for Confederate soldiers. After the war, in the 1870s, a prominent man named Thomas Swan bought the property. He tore down the slave pens in the yard. He added a mansard roof to the main building. He turned it into apartments. For over a century, the building was just apartments. Regular people lived there. Many probably didn't know its history. The building showed little hint of what it had been used for. In the 1990s, the Northern Virginia Urban League purchased the building. They installed an exhibit in the basement about the slave trade. They used the rest of the building for offices and classroom space. They named it Freedom House Museum. In 2005, the Virginia Department of Historic Resources erected a historical marker outside describing the building's history. In 1978, it had been designated a National Historic Landmark. It's also a Virginia Historic Landmark. Today, the building is a museum. Visitors can learn about Franklin and Armfield and the domestic slave trade. They can see the spaces where people were held. They can understand what happened there. The museum tells the story honestly, not sugarcoating it, not making excuses, just presenting the facts about what Franklin and Armfield did and how they built the largest slave trading operation in American history. Because that's what it was, the largest operation in American history. By volume of people sold, by geographic reach, by annual profit, by institutional infrastructure, Franklin and Armfield were at the top. They didn't invent the domestic slave trade, but they perfected it. They industrialized it. They created a system that was ruthlessly efficient at moving people from the Upper South to the Deep South. Other traders operated similarly, but Franklin and Armfield operated at a scale no one else matched. Their network of agents, their ownership of ships, their offices in multiple cities, their ability to hold hundreds of people at once, their annual throughput of over 1,000 people. Nobody else came close. And they did it all legally. Every purchase, every sale, every transport was legal under U.S. law. They kept records. They paid taxes. They operated openly. The system they worked within, the domestic slave trade, was an accepted part of American commerce in the early 1800s. That's what makes their story so important to understand. Franklin and Armfield weren't outlaws or criminals operating in shadows. They were successful businessmen operating in broad daylight. They advertised in newspapers. They worked with agents across multiple states. They shipped people on vessels that docked at public wharves. Everyone knew what they were doing. The domestic slave trade was a massive industry. Hundreds of thousands of people were forcibly moved from the Upper South to the Deep South between 1808 and 1865. Families were torn apart. People were sold away from everything they knew. Children were separated from parents, husbands from wives, siblings scattered. This internal forced migration was enormous. Some historians call it the Second Middle Passage because of how traumatic and disruptive it was. And Franklin and Armfield were the biggest players in making it happen. The building on Duke Street still stands. You can visit it. You can walk through the rooms where John Armfield lived and worked. You can see the basement where people were held. You can walk the yard where slave pens once stood. It looks like a normal old building from the outside. Federal architecture. Brick. 3 stories. Nothing about its appearance screams the horror of what happened there. But between 1828 and 1836, over 5,000 people, probably more, passed through that building. Children as young as 8 years old, young men and women, sometimes elderly people, all held there against their will, all waiting to be shipped south, all separated from their families. Isaac Franklin and John Armfield made millions of dollars from this operation. They became 2 of the richest men in America. They bought plantations. They built resort towns. They donated to universities. They died respected members of their communities. The thousands of people they sold disappeared into the Deep South. Most of their names are lost. Most of their stories are forgotten. We know some names from ship manifests: Bill, Elizabeth, Monroe, Lovey, Robert, Mary, and thousands of others. But we don't know what happened to them. We don't know if they survived the plantations. We don't know if they ever saw their families again. That's the legacy of Franklin and Armfield. Not just one building in Alexandria, not just 2 men who got rich, but thousands of families destroyed, thousands of lives disrupted, thousands of people forced into brutal labor in the Deep South. The domestic slave trade shaped America. It moved people from one region to another based purely on economic demand. It treated human beings as commodities to be bought, sold, and transported like any other goods. It operated with the full protection of U.S. law. And Franklin and Armfield perfected the system. They made it efficient. They made it profitable. They made it industrial scale. Today we can visit Freedom House Museum and learn this history. We can see the building and understand what it represented. We can honor the memory of the thousands of people who suffered there. That's important because this isn't ancient history. Franklin and Armfield operated in the 1830s. That's less than 200 years ago. There are people alive today whose great-great-grandparents could have been sold by Franklin and Armfield. The connections to the past are direct and recent. The building was designated a National Historic Landmark, not to honor Franklin and Armfield, but to preserve evidence of what they did, to make sure we don't forget, to teach future generations about this chapter of American history. The museum tells the truth. It doesn't say these were difficult times or everyone was doing it. It says this is what happened, this is who did it, this is how many people suffered. That honesty matters because the domestic slave trade wasn't a minor footnote in history. It was a major American industry. It involved thousands of traders, tens of thousands of transactions, hundreds of thousands of people forcibly moved from one place to another. Franklin and Armfield were the biggest, but they weren't alone. There were dozens of other major trading firms, hundreds of smaller traders, thousands of people involved in buying, transporting, and selling enslaved people. It was a system, an organized, legal, profitable system. And understanding that system helps us understand how injustice can be normalized, institutionalized, and made profitable when society allows it. Franklin and Armfield's success came from exploiting the price difference between the upper and lower South. That price difference existed because of the booming cotton and sugar economy in the Deep South, which existed because of technological changes like the cotton gin, which created demand for labor, which was filled by the domestic slave trade. It all connected. Economics, technology, law, and human suffering all tied together in a system that enriched some people while destroying others. And it operated openly. The building on Duke Street was right in the middle of Alexandria. Ships sailed from public docks. Coffles of chained people marched through towns on public roads. Newspapers ran advertisements. Everyone could see what was happening. That's perhaps the most disturbing part. Not that it happened in secret, but that it happened in plain sight. That respectable citizens walked past the building on Duke Street. That ship captains docked next to the Uncas and the Tribune. That townspeople saw coffles passing through and just accepted it as normal. The system allowed it. Society accepted it. The law protected it. And men like Franklin and Armfield profited from it enormously. Until they didn't. Until the Civil War ended slavery and the domestic slave trade along with it. Until the building on Duke Street was abandoned by its traders as Union troops arrived. Until the old man chained to the floor was freed. But by then, Franklin and Armfield were long retired. They'd made their fortunes. They'd lived their comfortable lives. They never faced consequences, never stood trial, never had to answer for the thousands of families they destroyed. That's the history. That's what happened at 1315 Duke Street in Alexandria, Virginia. That's the story of Franklin and Armfield, America's largest slave trading company. It's a hard history, but it's real history. And the museum preserves it so we can learn from it, understand it, and make sure we never forget what happened there. More than 5,000 people passed through that building between 1828 and 1836. most of them children and young adults, all of them separated from families, all of them sold into brutal conditions in the Deep South. That's what we remember, not Franklin and Armfield's wealth or success, but the thousands of people whose lives they destroyed in pursuit of profit. That's the story. That's what matters. That's what Freedom House Museum teaches.